Hey class, I'm going to talk about context, mood, and tone in this broadcast. Um, so let's start with context because context is hugely important in poetry. And sometimes it's really hard to see the context of a poem. But partly that is the responsibility of, like, for instance, your book. Your book should give you some context for some of the poetry. Having read through this book, it, a lot. I would say they do sometimes a poor job of that. Um, for instance, in my last class, there was a poem that we had a completely different take on, and then all of a sudden, someone was like, "Oh, this guy was like a Holocaust survivor, and this is what he's writing about," and we had no idea because we didn't know who the poet was and the background of the poet. So it's really important to kind of know the context of poetry if you can find it. So I'm going to show you a couple examples. One that you probably don't know, and one that you probably know really well, and are going to probably be surprised by it. I'm going to share my screen and show you some of this. So there's this poem by Paul Celan called, I think it's German, so bear with me, but Tottenberg. Um, and if you read it, there's flowers, there's people talking, there's a book. It talks about a thinker's word to come. There's forests, and there's a conversation clearly while driving, it says, et cetera, et cetera. But you might not really understand what's going on, which is fair. Like, on the surface, there's not a lot going on right here. Now, if you look this up, this is a very, very well contextualized poem because Paul Celan was a Holocaust survivor, and he was he described, at some point he described what he wanted. He wrote in German for his poetry, which you think might be contradictory, but what he said was, like, I want to write this in German because I want to destroy the German language. Now, if you look at the original words written, you'll start to see these words come together. Pierre Joris, for his translations, a lot of these words were put together. Like, I bright is not a word. I bright is two words, and Paul Celan shoves them together. Same with Forest Word. I think this the Poetry Foundation kind of has it wrong because I remember reading this and I think it's in one word. But anyway, so he wrote this poem, and he's known for tackling his Holocaust memories and his feelings around that in his poetry in a really obtuse way, meaning, like, he doesn't deal with it directly a lot of the times. So in this poem, it's actually about a meeting between him and Heidegger, who's a famous German philosopher who, for several years, was very deeply into Nazism. So you can imagine this Holocaust survivor and this, potentially former Nazi sympathizer meeting, and all those feelings being kind of dug up. And so you start to look at these words in a different way, right? Where, like, he's looking for a word from this guy who, again, if you look this up, he deeply respected at some time. And now, after the war, he's sitting there and he's like, this guy, like, caused the death of all of my friends and family and almost myself, maybe in an inadvertent way, but he was a part of that movement. And so you start to read this differently. You start to wonder, like, what is he hoping this guy is going to say to him? You start to realize he feels pretty I would say like despondent. There's not a lot to it because again, like he's hoping for maybe, I don't know, an apology or like some kind of word, but it seems like they didn't really talk about this thing that was hanging over them, right? Um, so it's really important to understand the context for it. You can look up something like this I pulled up and read through the whole thing and understand why this is important. This is actually written by the translator, so you can kind of believe that the translator would have done this research and figure out what this poem was about. Um, and another example is actually The Road Not Taken. A lot of people think this poem is about like, picking your path and, you know, choosing the path that people don't go down, like choosing your own path, being an individual, not going with the crowd, etc., etc. But actually, this poem was also about a walk between Robert Frost and his friend, and he wrote this poem as a joke because his friend was always very indecisive about the paths that he took in the woods. So this is actually a poem that was a joke that turned into probably his most well-known poem. Um, and it's been sort of misunderstood ever since, which is pretty funny that that happened. There's a lot of articles about this now, and obviously, you can translate it. You can take it the way you want to take it, right? You can create your own meaning, but the author's intention was to write this poem as like a gentle joke towards his friend. And then he became defined by this poem. So that's context. Context is kind of like, what do we need to know about the poem before we read it or after we read it to make it more understandable? And obviously, sometimes you can overdo it, and sometimes you don't need to do it. But sometimes it's really important, right? Like, it's important to know that this poem was written by a Holocaust survivor who was talking to a Nazi sympathizer. It's important to know that this poem might not necessarily be about individuality and it was a joke to a friend. It's important to know and doesn't mean that it takes away from what is happening in the poem. But it's whatever you could learn or know is important. So try your best to do some research into some of your poems, especially if you don't really feel like you get it. And you can't really see me, but I'm putting up scare quotes. Like, I think a lot of people feel intimidated by poetry. You don't have to get it. If you don't understand or you don't like the Robert Frost poem because it's a joke with his friend, like that's totally understandable. You can give your own context to it. But just understand that the author has their own context as well. So the other one that I want to talk about is mood and tone, the other two. So mood is really simple. Mood is kind of your feeling after reading it. It's the reader's understanding through feeling of the poem, right? So you might feel like this poem by Paul Celan is kind of like a little, I don't know, sad. Or that's how you react to it, right? Or you might feel really anxious reading The Road Not Taken because you're indecisive. But the mood is kind of like, what is the author doing to kind of put you in a mood that either reflects the poem itself or your response to it, right? So after reading this poem, how do you feel? Like, kind of think about your feeling. You could definitely use that in your reflections too. And then context and mood and tone, they all kind of come together. Tone is sort of how the author is making the poem through organizing it, through literary devices, through different things to kind of give you a sense of feeling. So it's kind of like, what does the author want to give you what kind of tone does the author want to set in their poem, right? So again, I think Paul Celan is trying to show you kind of this unsuredness, right? For Pride Month, the Poetry Foundation has these poems, and they're actually organized by feeling, right? So, like in this section, the feeling is being proud, right? Whereas this section is about ambivalence, or I would say even like sadness or anger. And so they write these poems in a way that makes you feel that way, right? So like their tone creates your mood sometimes. Um, and so you will see their anger through the words they choose. You will see what kind of, like, let's say someone wants to write a really scary poem. They're going to do that through different ways to make that tone feel scary. Maybe it's a lot of images that are scary. Maybe it's just like the rhythm is kind of fast and you never know where it's going to go, right? But yeah, in this case, you have like poems that are meant to invoke pride or proudness, right? And here you have poems that are meant to be a little either questioning or, you know, angry at some of the things that people have to deal with, right? So I highly recommend checking out some of these. But there you have it. So context is kind of like the things around why the poem was written. Mood is your reaction to the poem, and tone is how the author kind of wants you to feel through their words. And it's set up through how they set up their poem, right? And tone is also kind of translated by you differently. So don't feel like there's only one tone to a poem. Some people might see a poem as happy. Some people might see a poem as angry, even if it's the same poem. So just kind of keep that in mind. Context can really help with that, right? Because context will tell you a little bit more about why they wrote the poem. So hopefully that helps. I know this video is a little bit longer, but these are a little bit more complicated of issues. So if you need anything else explained with this, let me know. I can also provide more examples. All right, bye.